Chapter 1. In the Shadow of the Roof of the World. High above the clouds, where the air grows thin and the winds speak in hushed tones, lies a vast expanse unlike any other on earth, the Tibetan Plateau. A world carved from silence and sky, it stretches across the heart of Asia like the spine of a sleeping dragon. This land, often called the roof of the world, rises more than 4,500 meters above sea level. It is not just a place, it is a presence. Snow-capped peaks pierce the heavens like sacred spires, standing eternal watch over deep river valleys and endless grasslands. Lakes shimmer like mirrors, reflecting the sky so perfectly that it becomes hard to tell where the earth ends and the heavens begin. The cold here is not cruel, but quiet. It whispers through the prayer flags strung across mountain passes, fluttering like the breath of ancient spirits. This geography is not only dramatic, it is defining. Life here demands resilience, patience, and a deep harmony with nature. The people who have called this plateau home for thousands of years are not merely survivors. They are poets of the wind, sculptors of silence. Isolation has shaped their spirit. The long distances between valleys, the barriers of stone and ice, have nurtured a culture that values inner stillness as much as outward strength, even today. When travelers cross the high passes into this realm, they speak of a feeling, not just of altitude, but of something older, a sense of being watched not by men, but by the land itself. The plateau is more than terrain. It is a teacher, a shaper of minds and memory. And long before it became an empire, it was already a world unto itself. Whispers from prehistory, long before history carved its lines into scrolls and stones, Tibet lived in story. It lived in echo, in myth, in the low murmur of the wind moving through the bones of ancient mountains. Archaeological evidence tells us that humans first stepped onto this high plateau nearly 30,000 years ago, migrating from the lowlands and settling near river basins where the earth was kinder. They hunted wild yaks, they gathered roots. They learned to survive where few others dared to dwell. But what science cannot always grasp, story remembers. Passed from one fire circle to the next, from mother to son, from elder to child, were tales older than time itself. In these whispered legends, sky gods rode thunderclouds, casting lightning like spears. Earth spirits slumbered beneath sacred mountains, watching over the people like stone-hearted sentinels. Wolves, ravens, and snow leopards were not just animals. They were messengers, omens, protectors. Some stories spoke of warrior clans who descended from the stars, bearing fire and wisdom. Others told of serpent beings that slithered beneath lakes, guarding secrets too ancient for human ears. These were not just fables to pass the night. They were a living code, a memory of identity carried across centuries. Myth shaped the landscape as much as rivers and glaciers. To the early peoples of Tibet, the world was alive, a breathing, watching, whispering force. Though we may never fully know their names or the details of their days, these early dwellers left behind more than tools and bones. They left a feeling, a spiritual thread that still runs through Tibetan culture. Their myths laid the first stones in the path that would one day lead to kings and conquests. But for now, Tibet was still dreaming in its cradle of snow and silence. Before the empire, as centuries turned and the stars repeated their slow dance across the skies, the scattered peoples of Tibet began to take firmer root. By the first few centuries CE, this vast land had become a quilt of tribes and clans, each tucked into its own valley, shielded by mountains and guarded by old customs. There was no central government, no king whose word ruled the land. Instead, there were chiefs, shamans, and warlords, each a guardian of a small world. Some tribes raised livestock, their lives following the rhythm of the seasons. Others farmed barley in hidden valleys, building stone walls against the cold. Trade was rare and dangerous, but it did exist. Salt, wool, and turquoise passed between hands and over high passes. So did news. So did conflict. These early communities were not just separate, they were fiercely independent. Kinship meant everything. Blood ties were stronger than laws. Honor was often enforced at the point of a spear. If a stranger came from another valley, he was met with cautious silence or a drawn blade. The high peaks didn't just keep out foreign armies, they kept the people apart. Religion, too, was varied and localized. Before the rise of Buddhism, Tibet's spiritual life was woven from threads of animism and shamanism, a practice now known as Bön. Spirits inhabited every tree, every rock, every gust of wind. Priests called upon ancestors and mountain deities to bless the harvest or ward off misfortune. Every village had its rites, its protectors, its sacred places. Yet even in this patchwork of isolation, a quiet shift had begun. Rumors drifted on. The wind of a powerful family rising in the Yarlung Valley, of a leader unlike the rest, who spoke not just of survival, but of unity. The clans were strong, but scattered. What if someone could bring them together? What if the land that was many could become one? A land waiting for a dream. Sometimes history waits in silence for the right voice to call it forward. And in the heart of the Tibetan plateau, that moment was drawing near. The land, though vast and divided, held a hidden yearning, not only for survival, but for something greater. The people had endured, they had believed, they had shaped their lives around mountain gods and ancestral graves. But the winds were changing. Traders brought whispers from India and China. Strangers came with stories of kings and empires, of lands united beneath a single banner. It was as though Tibet was listening, tilting its ear toward the world beyond. There was, buried deep beneath centuries of snow and struggle, a quiet potential. The mountains had kept Tibet apart, but they had also preserved it. What had once been a shield might now become a stage. The plateau, high and wide as a dream, was waiting for someone bold enough to imagine more. In the Yarlung Valley, that dream was beginning to take form. A clan was rising, stronger than the others. Its leader was no ordinary chieftain. He did not only command, he inspired. His vision stretched beyond his own valley, beyond his own kin. He saw not just a people, but a nation, though he has not yet stepped fully into the light of history. His shadow was lengthening. His words, his victories, his ambition, they were beginning to weave something new. A new story, a new path, one that would shape the fate of Tibet for centuries to come. But for now, the land waited. The rivers ran as they always had. The snow fell without hurry. And high above it all, the peaks stood silent, ancient witnesses to a dream that had not yet spoken its name. Chapter 2. The Rise of Songtsen Gampo. In the soft cradle of the Yarlung Valley, where green pastures roll between quiet mountains and rivers meander like threads of silver, a child was born beneath a sky of shifting clouds and ancient winds. His name was Songtsen Gampo. It is said that from the moment he opened his eyes there was something different about him. Not just the blood of chieftains that ran through his veins, but a calm, steady presence, as if the boy had already seen many winters and waited patiently for his turn to lead. Born into the royal lineage of the Yarlung dynasty, he grew up surrounded by warriors and priests, old men who told stories by firelight, and women who wove history into song. The world he entered was not yet an empire. It was a scattered realm of clans and valleys, each with their own customs, loyalties, and gods. His father, Namri Songtsen, was already one of the more powerful chieftains in southern Tibet, a man who dreamed of something larger, though the mountains kept the people apart. Young Songtsen learned early that words could carry as much weight as swords. He listened more than he spoke. He watched. He absorbed the lessons of the land, the rhythm of migration, the skill of archers, the silence before a storm. And when his father died, likely poisoned by rivals, Songtsen Gampo was still a boy. Yet even in his youth he did not collapse beneath the burden. He stood unshaken, and the valley watched him. Whispers spread like wind over grass. The boy is not like the others. And as he grew, it became clear that he was not only to inherit power, he was destined to expand it, unifier of the clans. By the time Songtsen Gampo reached manhood, the land of Tibet remained a patchwork of stubborn leaders, each guarding their valley like a kingdom. Rivalries ran deep. Blood feuds burned like slow fires. For centuries, the idea of unity had been a dream, always beyond reach. But Songtsen saw what others could not. He began not with conquest, but with careful calculation. He strengthened alliances with clans that had once been enemies, promising security, trade, and shared power. Then, when words failed, he turned to the sword, not recklessly, but with purpose. His army, loyal and disciplined, moved like mist through the mountains. One by one, the independent clans either joined him or fell before him. There were no grand parades or declarations. The unification was slow, steady, deliberate, a weaving together of people who had lived apart for generations. In some valleys, children began learning the Yarlung dialect. In others, warriors took oaths to Songtsen's name. A new idea was taking root in the minds of the people, that they were not many tribes, but one nation. He built a centralized government, laying the foundation for what would become Tibet's first imperial system. Ministers were appointed. Laws were recorded. Messengers rode between valleys carrying not just orders, but a sense of belonging. In Songtsen Gampo, the people saw not just a warrior, but a visionary, a leader who held both fire and water, strength and peace, in equal measure. For the first time, the high plateau had a single voice, and it echoed across the mountains with quiet power, a marriage of worlds. But Songtsen Gampo knew that true unity required more than swords and treaties. It needed wisdom from beyond the borders of his land, It needed connection and vision that reached past the mountaintops. His next move was not war, but marriage. First he looked to the south, to the lush valleys of Nepal. There he arranged to marry Princess Prakuti, a woman of grace and intelligence. Her dowry brought artisans, builders, and, most importantly, Buddhist scriptures. With her came not only beauty, but belief. Temples began to rise. Statues of the Buddha arrived in carved crates carried by yak caravans. The spiritual winds began to shift. Then Songtsen turned his gaze eastward toward the mighty Tang dynasty in China, a realm vast and powerful. There he secured the hand of Princess Wensheng, niece of the emperor. This alliance was more than symbolic. With her came silk, tea, astronomical charts, and texts on governance. But she too carried something deeper, a sacred statue of the young Buddha, said to be crafted during his lifetime. It would become one of the most revered relics in Tibetan history. These marriages were not mere unions of bodies or kingdoms. They were bridges between worlds. Nepal and China were vastly different, in language, in thought, in spirit. But through these alliances, Tibet opened its heart. It welcomed ideas, architecture, medicine, and philosophy. Songtsen Gampo, once a boy raised in oral tales and mountain warfare, became the architect of a cultural awakening. It was not an easy path. Some resisted change, others feared foreign influence. But Songtsen was patient. He knew that empires built only on conquest crumble with time. He wanted more, a legacy not of bloodshed, but of transformation. The birth of a capital. Every empire needs a heart, a place where power breathes and spirit gathers. For Songtsen Gampo, that place would be Lhasa, in a broad valley cradled by mountains and fed by the waters of the Kaichu River. The king saw a vision. Here he would build not just a city, but a symbol. Lhasa, place of the gods. It began with temples, Jokang and Ramosh, built to house the sacred relics brought by his queens, rose from the earth like stone prayers. Pilgrims began to arrive, their feet tracing paths into the dirt that would become roads. Traders followed, bringing salt, wool, barley, and gold. Priests came too, not just Tibetan, but from India and China. The air buzzed with debate, prayer, and song. Lhasa was never just walls and streets. It was a feeling, a crossroads of heaven and earth, a place where old spirits and new ideas met beneath the shadow of the mountains. And high above it all, the foundations of a palace were laid, a fortress that would in time become the legendary Potala. But even in its earliest form, it stood not as a fortress of war, but of vision. From here, Songtsen Gampo ruled, not with arrogance, but with purpose. His laws were fair, his ministers educated, and his dream, once a whisper in the Yarlung winds, had become a reality. Tibet, once divided, now had a capital, a throne, a soul. And as prayer wheels spun and incense rose into the sky, a new chapter was beginning, not just in the life of one man, but in the destiny of a people. Chapter 3. The Coming of the Dharma. Long before the sound of temple bells echoed through the valleys of Tibet, before the golden statues of the Buddha watched over the people, there was a different kind of spiritual world, one born from wind and fire, ice and stone. This was a land shaped by the elements, and the beliefs that filled it were just as wild, just as raw. The early people of Tibet did not read from sacred books. They did not sit in monasteries or chant in lines. Instead, they looked to the mountains, to the sky, to the rivers that flowed from the glaciers. In every shape of nature they saw power, and in that power they saw spirit. Animism and shamanism guided their lives. Every rock might hold a memory. Every tree could whisper a message. Spirits were everywhere, some kind, some angry, all demanding respect. Lightning was not just weather, it was a voice. Wind was not just air, it was the breath of a god among. These ancient practices rose something more formal, something fierce and rooted, the bonne religion. It became the heart of Tibet's early spiritual life. Its priests wore tall black hats and performed elaborate rituals to keep the spirits in balance. They painted symbols on stones, burned incense to chase away darkness, and made offerings. To unseen beings, Bon was more than religion. It was survival. When sickness struck or crops failed, the people turned to Bon. When death came, they trusted its priests to guide the soul through unseen worlds. These were beliefs not built on mercy, but on awe, on fear, on wonder, on an understanding that the world was full of things beyond the human eye. This was the spiritual world of Tibet, wild, deep, and mysterious. It would not vanish when Buddhism arrived. Instead, it would blend and twist and become something new. Buddhism's arrival from the south. The winds from the south brought change, not loud, not sudden, but steady, like a distant drumbeat growing clearer each year. Down in the lowlands of Nepal and India, a different way of seeing the world had taken root. A quiet path of meditation, of compassion, of understanding, suffering, and letting go. This path had begun under a tree, beneath the gaze of the stars, where a prince named Siddhartha had become the Buddha. Now, centuries later, his teachings began to travel. Carried not by soldiers, but by monks in saffron robes. They came with scrolls instead of swords, with chants instead of commands. And slowly, step by step, they climbed the mountain passes into the land of snow. At first, they were strangers, soft-spoken visitors in a land ruled by winds and spirits. But they brought stories that stirred something deep in the hearts of the Tibetan people. Stories of rebirth, of karma, of a path beyond pain. These ideas were strange, yet they felt familiar, like remembering something forgotten long ago. The cool teachings came through Nepal, where Songtsen Gampo's marriage to Princess Brakuti created a sacred bridge. Buddhist texts crossed that bridge one by one. Images of the Buddha were carried in carved boxes. Small statues arrived, polished and golden, each one a quiet flame in a land of stone. Some resisted. Bon priests warned of foreign ideas. But others listened, especially those who saw in the Buddha's words a new kind of strength, a power not based on fear, but on peace. Slowly, the two traditions began to live side by side. The spirits of the mountains were still honored, but now so was the teaching of emptiness, of love, of letting go. The Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha, had arrived, and with it a new chapter in Tibet's story was ready to be written. The king's sacred mission. Songtsen Gampo was more than a warrior, more than a unifier. Beneath the crown and the sword, he was also a seeker, someone who wanted to understand the deeper rhythms of life, the truths hidden beneath the surface. He had grown up with Bon. He had seen the power of old rituals. But when the teachings of Buddhism reached his ears, something shifted. He saw in them not weakness, but wisdom, not foreign confusion, but quiet clarity. And so the king began to change the kingdom. He ordered the translation of Buddhist texts into the Tibetan language. Monks from India and Nepal were invited to the court, asked to share their knowledge. He supported the creation of a Tibetan script, a written form of the language that would make translation possible. Knowledge once kept in foreign tongues could now speak in the voice of the plateau. Songtsen Gampo did not preach. He did not demand conversion. Instead, he led by example. He read the sutras. He built temples. He listened to the monks as they explained the Four Noble Truths and the path of compassion. He spoke of karma and rebirth with the same gravity he once used for law and battle. To his people, this was something new, a king not just of the body, but of the mind, a ruler who cared not only for land and cattle, but for the soul. Under his guidance, Buddhism was not forced into the land, it was invited, planted gently like seeds in spring, and in time it began to grow, in the hearts of the people, in the minds of the young, and in the rhythm of daily life. For Songtsen Gampo, this mission was not about power, it was about meaning. He wanted more than unity. He wanted harmony. Between old and new, between sword and scripture, between earth and sky, temples in stone and silence. In the heart of Lhasa, beneath the gaze of the mountains, two temples rose slowly from the ground, not as monuments to power, but as gifts to the sacred. The Yokang Temple, commissioned by the king and built with the blessings of Princess Prikuti, became a place of deep stillness. Its walls were carved with care, each stone laid like a prayer. Inside, the air smelled of incense. Candles flickered beside golden statues. The halls echoed with the soft chants of monks, a song to the quiet truths of the universe. Not far away stood the Ramoch Temple, shaped by the presence of Princess Wensheng. Where Yokang looked to Nepal, Ramoche faced China. Together they formed a spiritual axis, two arms of the same soul reaching out to the sky. These temples were more than buildings. They were symbols of unity, of belief, of a future shaped by peace. Travelers came from across Tibet to kneel in their shadows. Pilgrims whispered wishes at their doors. Monks studied within their walls, preserving the Dharma for generations to come. But perhaps their greatest gift was silence. Within those stone walls there was space to breathe, to listen, to feel the presence of something vast and kind and still. Songtsen Gampo did not live to see how far the Dharma would travel in his land. But he saw the beginning, the gentle unfolding of a new vision. And as the wind moved through the prayer flag strung across temple roofs, it carried with it the king's dream, a dream of peace in a land once ruled by battle, a dream of wisdom in a world once ruled by fear, a dream that would echo long after. Stone had weathered and kings had passed in the sacred heart of Tibet. Chapter 4. Thrones, Blood and Succession. The soft wind of the highlands carried with it the echoes of a dying king. Songtsen Gampo, unifier visionary, the first true emperor of Tibet, had passed into legend. and with his death came the silence of uncertainty. The mighty walls of Lhasa stood firm, but within them the question of succession loomed like a shadow across the land. His descendants, though of royal blood, did not inherit the clarity of purpose he had once embodied. The golden age he sparked now rested in the unsteady hands of sons and nephews, some earnest, others ambitious, all unprepared for the weight of the crown. Tibet was no longer a loose gathering of valleys and mountain clans. It had become an empire, stretching across the Himalayan spine, binding together regions with differing tongues, gods, and customs. With this vastness came fragility. Unity, once won through vision and force, now required wisdom and compromise. The throne, once solid beneath Gampo, now trembled under the shifting weight of politics. Marriages were arranged not for love, but for leverage. Monasteries whispered counsel to princes. Soldiers, once united under a single banner, began to pledge themselves to individuals, not ideals. Songtsen Gampo had laid the foundation, but it was his heirs who would be tested, each one standing in the long shadow of his greatness, burdened by a legacy they could neither match nor escape. The rival brothers. As the sun set on Songtsen's era, a bitter wind swept through the halls of the royal court. Two brothers, Tride Tsuktsen and Trisong Detsen, emerged as central figures in the unfolding drama. Sons of lineage, yes, but heirs of conflict. Tsuktsen, the elder, bore the crown but not the loyalty of the realm. His rule was marked by hesitation and the heavy hand of his advisers. Around him, noble houses whispered discontent. Some saw him as a puppet, others as a placeholder. Power in those years did not sit comfortably on his shoulders. Trisong Detsen, the younger, was different. Quiet, watchful, thoughtful. He had inherited more than just blood. He had inherited his grandfather's hunger for unity. Yet his ambitions stirred resentment. To many in court, he was a threat, an idea, not a person. Where Tsuktsen ruled, Trisong inspired. And inspiration in the court of kings could be dangerous. Their rivalry was not a matter of open war, but of silent maneuvering. Allies shifted like mountain clouds. Court scribes recorded proclamations in the morning, only to rewrite them by evening. The balance teetered, and with every season the empire seemed to inch closer to fracture. It was not swords that drew the first blood, it was suspicion, letters intercepted, allegiances questioned. A single glance could turn into a declaration of treason. In this cold war of kinship, every gesture mattered. And when Tsuktsen fell, whether by fate or force, the road was cleared for Trisong Detsen. But what he inherited was not the glory of Tibet. It was its burden. Rise of the regents, with each succession, a new pattern emerged. Emperors grew younger, and regents grew stronger. The regents, noble ministers, military generals, and spiritual advisers began as aides to the throne. But slowly they became its architects. They wielded soft power with a firm grip, guiding or even overriding the will of the child emperors they served. Most infamous among them were the Ga clan, a noble family that rose to prominence through military success and strategic loyalty. Ostensibly protectors of the realm, they quietly built a parallel power. They married into royalty, commanded armies, and oversaw courtly matters as though the empire belonged to them. Their leader, Tongtsen, had once been Songtsen Gampo's trusted advisor. But in his descendants, the line between service and control blurred. At times, the emperor seemed more a ceremonial figure, blessing decisions already made behind closed doors. There were benefits, of course. The Ga clan brought stability during volatile times. They negotiated with Chinese envoys, quelled rebellions, and maintained the empire's borders. But with each success, their grip tightened, and Tibet began to forget what it meant to be ruled by a sovereign rather than a steward. Eventually, the imperial house reacted. Trisong Detsen, now matured and aware, orchestrated a quiet but decisive return to direct rule. He dismantled the Ga clan's network and restored imperial authority. Yet the memory lingered. Tibet had become a chessboard where kings did not always make the moves. The strain of unity. Beneath the blue dome of the sky, the Tibetan Empire stretched wide, but not peacefully. What had once been a noble dream of unity had become a daily battle of balance. The eastern territories, where Chinese influence loomed, whispered of alliances and demanded attention. The western valleys, steeped in older beliefs and tribal customs, pulled away from Lhasa's religious reforms. In the north, border clans challenged imperial authority. In the south, India's cultural tide brought both inspiration and resistance. The empire was a patchwork quilt of faiths, languages, and loyalties. Songtsen Gampo had stitched it together through conquest and charisma, but keeping it whole required more than vision. It required compromise. And compromise in the hands of rulers burdened by ambition and ministers hungry for power often frayed. Buddhism, once a unifying thread, began to divide as well. Monasteries gained land and wealth. Nobles either embraced the new faith or resented its growing influence. The court became a theatre of quiet contests between the old ways and the new light. Infrastructure strained. Grain routes faltered. Taxation became erratic. Temples rose while roads crumbled. Commoners began to feel the weight of distant decisions, and their loyalty shifted with the seasons. Even the elite, once bound by shared purpose, fractured into factions. Some longed for a return to centralized strength, others advocated for regional autonomy. The empire, caught in its own contradictions, began to breathe unevenly, expanding and contracting with every generation, and yet Tibet endured, because even in the midst of struggle there was beauty. The snow peaks still stood. The chants in the monasteries still echoed through the valleys. The dream of unity, though strained, had not been abandoned. It merely waited for a ruler wise enough to revive it and a people strong enough to believe in it again. Chapter 5. The Age of Expansion. In the stillness of the high Himalayan valleys, a transformation had begun. What once was a kingdom, tucked away in the folds of the mountains, was now reaching out with intent. The early rulers of Tibet had unified their people, built temples of stone, and crowned kings of vision. But now their eyes turned outward, toward the vast lands that lay beyond the clouds. The Tibetan Empire, still young and full of ambition, stood on the edge of something larger. The restless winds over the plateau seemed to whisper a single word: expansion. Under the reign of emperors like Trisong Detsen, the empire did not simply grow. It surged forward with purpose and pride. Commanders rode eastward into the soft hills of China, westward into the deserts and oasis towns of Central Asia, and southward along the winding trails of the Indian subcontinent. Each direction held opportunity and danger. It was a time of marching banners and echoing drums. Soldiers left their home valleys, crossing glaciers, rivers, and barren plains, carrying the hopes of the empire in their armor and chants. For every mile gained, there was a price. But to the empire, the reward was vast: more territory, more tribute, more recognition. The once insulated kingdom began to change in spirit. Towns became fortified outposts. Traders brought news of distant lands. New scripts were etched onto tablets. The world was no longer distant. It was being pulled into Tibet's orbit, step by step, march by march. But with every expansion, the empire grew more complex. Cultures clashed, languages mixed. The very identity of Tibet, once shaped in isolation, now faced the great storm of diversity. Yet, for a time, it thrived, it expanded, it became legend, clashing with the Tang dynasty. The path eastward led Tibet to a formidable threshold, the empire of the Tang. China, in the 8th century, was a colossus. It was rich, organized, and ancient. But it was also vulnerable. Its borders, like all empires, were porous and restless. And into this tension, Tibet stepped boldly. The conflict between Tibet and the Tang was not a single war. It was a long, breathing series of confrontations, truces, betrayals, and uneasy alliances. The great cities of Chang'an and Lhasa did not merely exchange words, they exchanged soldiers, strategies, and wounds. One of the earliest and most dramatic confrontations came with the capture of Chang'an itself. In the year 763, Tibetan forces marched east with lightning speed, entering the heart of Tang territory. For a brief moment in history, they took control of the Chinese capital, a staggering feat that echoed across the continent. Though their stay was short, it left a mark. In stone inscriptions and dusty chronicles, the tale of the Tibetans in Chang'an would become a symbol of pride for some, of humiliation for others. Diplomats scurried to broker terms, treaties were drafted, then ignored, armies repositioned, and borders blurred. Through it all, both empires saw in each other a mirror of power and a reflection of threat. The Tang saw Tibet as wild but cunning. Tibet saw China as mighty but overstretched. The truth, as always, was more complicated. Beyond the battlefield, there were exchanges of another kind. Monks crossed the frontier, carrying sacred texts and teachings. Artists traveled under the guise of pilgrims, painting frescoes and sharing styles. Even in conflict, the currents of culture flowed, but the battles left scars on the land, on the people, on the memory of empires. Each victory was temporary, each truce a pause in a story written in dust and blood. And still the two giants circled each other, aware that neither could truly break the other without breaking themselves. The raiders of the Silk Road, while the armies pressed east and south, another frontier drew Tibet's gaze, the great artery of commerce and culture known as the Silk Road. Stretching like a living thread across Asia, the Silk Road connected empires, deserts, and civilizations. It was not a single path, but a network of winding trails, merchant towns and ancient caravans, and Tibet, high upon its plateau, sought to control the passes where these threads met. From the shadows of the Pamir Mountains to the green valleys of Kashmir, Tibetan forces seized fortresses, collected tolls, and established influence. The Empire's presence became a fact of life for those who traded silks, spices, and sacred objects across the continent. But it was not just about wealth. The Silk Road brought more than gold. It brought ideas. Buddhist monks from India travelled northward, welcomed into Tibetan courts. Manuscripts, fragile and handwritten, were copied and translated, rituals merged, new gods found altars, languages blended. In the markets of Dunhuang, one could hear Tibetan alongside Persian, Chinese beside Sogdian. Traders set up tents beside temples. Horses wore cloth dyed with Indian indigo, and swords bore scripts from Central Asia. In this swirl of colour and culture, Tibet was no longer a distant realm. It was a participant in a shared human drama. And yet control was never complete. Raiders haunted the trails. Local warlords resisted taxation. The empire's grip on the trade routes was powerful but always contested. Still, for a time, Tibet stood not only as a mountain kingdom, but as a gatekeeper between worlds. And from this gate, it absorbed the richness of 1,000 lands, the price of power, but no expansion comes without cost. As the empire grew outward, its heart began to feel the strain. The armies, once symbols of unity, now faced exhaustion. Soldiers, stationed far from home, began to desert. Garrisons ran low on supplies. Letters from frontier commanders grew desperate, their ink heavy with worry. At home, nobles began to question the wisdom of endless campaigns. Why fight for distant hills? When the villages nearby needed grain, why build forts in deserts while the temples at home crumbled? Voices of dissent grew louder at court, in monasteries, and among the farmers who bore the burden of taxes. The unity that had driven Tibet forward began to fray. Different regions, once proud to wear the imperial seal, began to seek autonomy. Ambitious lords, enriched by war, started carving out their own spheres of control. The capital tried to tighten its grip, but the fingers were too far apart. Even religion, once a binding force, became a source of tension. Different Buddhist sects jostled for influence, old beliefs pushed back. Monasteries expanded their power, sometimes clashing with the nobles or with each other. The harmony of the early empire gave way to competition and confusion. The people, too, felt the burden. Taxes rose, roads broke. Fields went untended as young men were drafted into distant wars. In some provinces, revolts began to simmer. In others, disillusionment settled like a fog. Tibet had reached its golden peak. But from that height, every step forward became more fragile. The empire had touched the edges of the world, but in doing so, it risked losing its own center. Still, the legacy endured. In stone, in scripture, in the whispered songs of mountain passes, the memory of this great age lived on, not only as triumph, but as a warning. Power can stretch far, but never without pulling at the threads that hold it together. Chapter 6. Empire of Monks and Warriors. In the golden dawn of the Tibetan Empire, where snow peaks caught the first rays of sunlight and valleys echoed with the soft hum of prayer wheels, a unique paradox took root, one that would come to define a civilization. It was a land where warriors prayed before battle and monks wielded influence that reached the ears of kings. The Tibetan Empire was not just forged by the sword, it was shaped by the scroll. And between these two instruments, steel and scripture, a great legacy was born. The emperors, heirs of Songtsen Gampo, saw themselves as more than rulers. They were protectors of a vision, a kingdom of both power and purpose. They conquered lands and minds alike, believing deeply that temporal strength could be harmonized with spiritual truth, It was not an easy balance. To the east, rival armies marched. To the south, scholars arrived bearing doctrines of Dharma and enlightenment. And within Tibet's own borders, lords and abbots began to shape the realm as much as generals did. But instead of choosing one path, Tibet chose both. Commanders knelt beside monks. Royal decrees carried Buddhist blessings. Even battle flags bore mantras. The Tibetan identity became an alloy, equal parts devotion and dominion. It was this duality that gave the empire its resilience. Where others might fracture under the weight of contradiction, Tibet thrived in its complexity. Because the sword protected the scroll, and the scroll sanctified the sword. Monasteries in the mountains, as the empire expanded, a quiet revolution unfolded high in the hills and deep within the forests, a flowering of monastic life unlike anything Tibet had known before. Temples of stone rose like silent sentinels, carved into cliffsides, nestled beside rivers, or perched atop high ridges. These monasteries became more than places of prayer. They were sanctuaries of thought, of peace, and more, of influence. Monks in saffron robes walked the halls in silence, their sandals brushing across worn stones. They studied texts brought from India, copying each word by hand, preserving a lineage that stretched back to the Buddha himself. The scent of butter lamps filled the air, while the rhythmic beat of drums and the low chant of prayers echoed through cold corridors. But beyond meditation, something else was taking shape. These monasteries began to function as centers of administration. Landowners offered gifts of grain and gold. Kings granted them estates. In return, the monks offered guidance on philosophy, yes, but also on governance. Diplomats consulted abbots. Soldiers sought blessings before campaigns. Even emperors waited for the advice of oracles before launching a war or signing a treaty. Some monasteries became powerful landholders, managing entire valleys. Their abbots wielded influence akin to lords, and while some saw this as corruption, others believed it was harmony, where wisdom guided power and power protected wisdom. These high sanctuaries also attracted seekers. From distant corners of Asia, pilgrims came to learn, to bow, to listen. And in doing so, they carried Tibet's name, its teachings, its practices, far beyond its borders. The mountains, once barriers, had become beacons, and the monasteries, though built of stone, stood as soft-hearted monuments to a people chasing something greater than conquest, peace through understanding, power through stillness. The warrior kings of faith amid this growing union of military strength and spiritual discipline, a new kind of leader emerged, emperors who saw no divide between crown and rosary, between sword and sutra. Foremost among them was Trizong Detsen. He ruled not just with authority, but with vision. He expanded borders while inviting scholars into his halls. He commanded armies, but also summoned Indian monks to translate sacred texts. He believed that an emperor must not only protect the body of the empire, but also nurture its soul. Under his reign, Buddhism was declared the state religion. Monasteries flourished with royal patronage. Debates were held in public squares, not with weapons but with words. Tibetan lamas on one side, Indian masters on the other, watched over by the emperor himself. Trizong Detsen did not just build fortresses. He built Samye, Tibet's first great monastery. Its design mirrored the universe as seen through Buddhist eyes, and in its halls knowledge replaced fear. Here, soldiers knelt beside scholars and generals discussed compassion. Other rulers followed this path, each with their own blend of iron and incense. They led troops into battle by day and lit butter lamps by night. They invoked divine power but understood the weight of earthly decisions. This model, the warrior king of faith, was rare in the world. In Tibet it became revered. The emperor was not a god but a bridge between heaven and earth, between past and future. These kings reminded their people that greatness was not only measured in victories, but in virtue. And though they wore armor, their most lasting legacies were built in the quiet spaces of thought, teaching, and transformation. Echoes of enlightenment and iron, as the winds swept across the high plains and through temple corridors, they carried with them the echoes of a time when the Tibetan Empire stood not just as a realm of conquest, but as a kingdom of balance. It was a golden age carved by many hands, those who held spears and those who held scripture. And it was held together, not by force alone, but by faith, the kind of faith that builds cities, that preserves languages, that outlives kings. From the frontiers of Central Asia to the whispering forests of the Himalayas, Tibet's presence could be felt. Not just in the shadows of fortresses, but in the minds of monks, in the breath of chants, in the calm discipline of students learning to read the sacred words. And yet, within all of this beauty, there was tension. The monks and the warriors did not always agree. Power, even when sanctified, is still power. Monasteries, as they grew wealthier, sometimes forgot their vows. Generals, as they gained victories, sometimes ignored the teachings they claimed to uphold. But these were not failings, they were reminders that the path between enlightenment and empire is narrow, that human ambition walks hand in hand with divine aspiration, and that all golden ages carry within them the seeds of their own questions. Still, the Tibetan Empire stood unique. It dared to dream of a world where war served wisdom, and wisdom tempered war, where rulers were taught by monks, and monks guided the swords of kings. Few civilizations tried to walk this path. Fewer still succeeded. And though that age would one day fade, its legacy remained, etched in stone, in memory, in mantra. It lived on in the temples that still hum with sacred sound, in the trails once walked by armored pilgrims, in the very idea that power, to be meaningful, must be bound to purpose. In Tibet, the scroll and the sword walked together. And in that walk, they shaped not only a nation but a vision of what a people can become when they strive for strength, not to dominate, but to enlighten. Chapter 7. The Imperial Court and its Secrets. Behind the high walls of the Tibetan Imperial Palace, far from the clang of swords and the dust of battlefields, another world unfolded, a quieter world, a world of silks and scrolls, of incense, smoke drifting like memory, of whispered advice and silent glances. This was the imperial court, where power moved in hushed tones and unseen hands. The palace was not merely a residence. It was a stage of shadows and secrets, where the game of empire played out without a single clash of arms. Every room had ears, every servant had a master, every offering of tea came with the weight of meaning. Ministers walked its halls in layered robes, their faces calm, their words measured. Monks offered blessings, but their chants often echoed alongside political calculations. Mystics traced symbols in the dust, their readings of stars influencing matters of law and war. Here, diplomacy and divination danced together. Not all who held influence wore crowns, some wielded scrolls. Ancient texts were studied not only for spiritual wisdom, but for coded messages of governance, law, and legacy. The past was consulted as much as oracles were. And then there were the spies. In a court so finely balanced, information was as valuable as gold. Letters were intercepted, servants were questioned, rumors flowed like water through the stone corridors. What seemed like a casual remark might change the fate of a province. Trust was rare. Secrecy was sacred. Foreign ambassadors bowed in awe, unable to decipher the layers behind every ritual. The Tibetan court was not just organized, it was orchestrated, like a performance only insiders could truly understand. This was not the heart of the empire. It was its mind, thinking, plotting, remembering. A place where decisions were shaped, not with steel, but with silence. Women of the golden palace beyond, the veils of brocade and behind the screens of carved sandalwood, lived the women of the palace. To outsiders they were invisible. To historians they are often overlooked. But in the unfolding drama of Tibetan rule, these women were powerful players, mothers, queens, consorts, and visionaries. They walked the polished stone corridors in silence, but their footsteps guided dynasties. The Queen Mother often held more sway than the Emperor himself, especially when her son ascended the throne as a child. In such cases she became regent in all but name, sitting behind curtains during council meetings, offering guidance that shaped policy, diplomacy, and the fate of the realm. Wives of emperors came from noble houses, each bringing with them alliances. That stitched regions into the fabric of empire. A marriage was never just a union, it was a declaration of loyalty, a chess move, a silent treaty. The Queen's presence at court could signal which clans held favour, which monasteries prospered, and which ministers should be cautious. And there were others, less public, more discreet, courtesans and concubines. Some dismissed, others trusted. A few rose in rank, becoming quiet counsellors. In a palace of secrets, their voices often reached farther than the throne. Many of these women were deeply spiritual. Some became patrons of temples. Others financed the copying of sacred texts, ensuring that the Dharma would survive beyond war and politics. A few even became spiritual teachers in their own right, commanding respect from both monks and ministers. They were not soldiers. They led no armies, but their influence flowed like the rivers that fed the valleys, quiet, essential, and enduring. Without them, the empire would have crumbled, not from invasion, but from within. Ministers in the shadows, every emperor wore a crown, but not every decision was his own. Within the court, a select group of ministers held extraordinary power, men whose names seldom appeared in the annals of glory, yet whose decisions shaped the empire as deeply as any battlefield victory. They were not the loudest voices in the hall, but they were the ones people listened to. At the top sat the great minister, a role both revered and feared. Appointed by the emperor, this figure managed the day-to-day affairs of the empire, from military campaigns to taxation, from temple funding to foreign envoys. At times he acted as the true architect of imperial policy, speaking softly but shaping destiny. Beneath him were lesser ministers, some in charge of specific regions, others of specialized domains like religious affairs, trade, or intelligence. These men had deep networks. They had eyes in every town and ears in every monastery. They knew who whispered rebellion, who miscounted grain, who plotted alliances. Some came from noble bloodlines. Others rose through merit, scribes who became advisors, generals who gained the emperor's trust, and once they reached the court, they rarely left it. Ministers did not retire. They were replaced, often suddenly, sometimes mysteriously. Loyalty was demanded, but paranoia was expected. Allies today could be enemies tomorrow. A misstep could mean exile, or worse. The court, after all, was not only a place of governance. It was a crucible of ambition, and yet, in all its danger, the system worked. The empire endured. Because these ministers, though hidden in shadow, kept the machinery of Tibet running, silent hands on the great wheel of rule. Ritual and rule in the heart of the palace, amid the scent of burning juniper and the soft glow of butter lamps. Time moved not by clocks, but by omens, rituals, and celestial rhythms. To rule in Tibet was not simply to govern, it was to live in harmony with the universe. Each decision, no matter how mundane, was aligned with forces greater than the self. The stars were consulted, dreams were interpreted, prayers were offered before scrolls were signed. The day began with rituals. The emperor's first steps were guided by auspicious timing. Monks chanted blessings as incense curled through the corridors. Offerings were placed at altars, grains, flowers, and water arranged with care. Bells chimed softly as the court awakened. Not to commands, but to cadence, astrologers held seats beside generals. Their charts determined when to march, when to rest, when to sign treaties. A storm in the sky could delay an invasion. A shadow on the moon might pause a coronation. These were not superstitions, they were systems. Passed down through generations, tested by time, and woven into the fabric of governance. Even the design of the palace mirrored the cosmos. Doors aligned with cardinal points. Courtyards echoed sacred geometry. Gardens reflected the inner balance sought by the empire itself. Foreigners often found this strange. They expected armies and laws, not chants and constellations. But to the Tibetans there was no divide. Politics was not separate from spirituality. To rule justly, one had to be aligned with heaven, with earth, with the unseen forces that held it all together. And so, each day unfolded like a sacred text. Read not with eyes, but with heart. The empire breathed through ritual, steady, rhythmic, eternal. Chapter 8. Tibet and the World Beyond. Beyond the quiet stillness of Tibet's mountain valleys, the world pulsed with motion. Camels trekked across golden sands, bells jingling softly under starry skies. Merchants whispered stories beside flickering fires. Monks with shaved heads and weathered robes travelled far from home, their only companions scrolls, chants, and questions. This was the world of the Silk Road, a living artery that connected civilizations, beliefs, and dreams. And in time, Tibet stepped into this world, not as a distant kingdom, but as a vital link in its journey. Once a land wrapped in clouds and guarded by peaks, Tibet opened its gates with quiet confidence. From its passes came not only warriors but wisdom, Pilgrims journeyed to India to visit the birthplaces of the Buddha, collecting teachings like sacred seeds. They returned with Sanskrit texts, carried in leather satchels and sewn into their robes, determined to plant them in Tibetan soil. But it wasn't just monks who travelled. Poets too wandered. Some wrote of mountain spirits and Dharma kings, while others told tales of Chinese cities glittering in the dusk, or bazaars in Kashgar, where Persian spices perfumed the air. Their verses recorded more than places, they captured the meeting of worlds. The trade routes brought goods, yes, silks from the east, jewels from the south, incense from the west, but also stories. Traders shared myths of firebirds and flying carpets, while mystics from Bactria taught of inner alchemy and stars that guided destinies. Tibet, once inward-looking, became a mirror to the world. Every scroll that crossed its borders was read with care. Every tale that echoed in the marketplace became part of the larger song. And through these travellers, pilgrims and poets alike, Tibet found its place not only on the map, but in the memory of a world ever in motion. Embassies and emperors far beyond the snowy passes of Tibet, great empires watched one another like stars circling in the night sky. China, vast and ancient, India, sacred and storied, the Abbasid Caliphate glittering in Baghdad's golden domes. To stand among them, Tibet needed not just swords but symbols, gifts, words and gestures. And so the embassies began. Tibetan envoys rode forth in ceremonial robes, their horses draped in brocade. They carried letters etched in gold, sealed with wax and wrapped in silk. Behind them followed musicians, translators, monks and guards, an entire moving court of courtesy. When they arrived at foreign palaces, they bowed with grace and offered gifts, turquoise from the mountains, medicinal herbs, and rare texts copied in meticulous hand. To China they brought tribute and demands. Sometimes they sought alliances, other times territory, or the release of monks captured in skirmishes. The Tang emperors received them with both caution and ceremony, aware of Tibet's growing strength. In India, the mood was different. There, Tibetan monks engaged in debates with Brahmins and Buddhists alike. Temples welcomed them as students, and their offerings were prayers rather than politics. The exchange was deep and spiritual, leaving a mark on Tibetan thought for centuries. To the west, under desert skies, emissaries made contact with the caliphate. It was not always peaceful, yet there was mutual curiosity. While they did not share the same gods, they recognized shared ambitions, order, knowledge, and legacy. Some scholars believe Tibetan scrolls traveled as far as Baghdad, while Islamic mathematical texts trickled into Himalayan monasteries in return. In each encounter, Tibet did not posture as inferior. It stood tall, grounded in mountain strength and spiritual depth. Its diplomats moved like monks and spoke like sages. And through their journeys, the empire declared not only its presence, but its elegance. Enemies at the gate, but while some doors opened with ceremony and gifts, others opened with tension. Empire invites envy, and Tibet's rise did not go unnoticed. To the north, the steppes rolled endlessly, home to fierce horsemen, nomadic tribes who lived by the rhythm of hoofbeats and the curve of the bow. They watched Tibet's caravans with interest. Sometimes they traded, other times they raided. These steppe warriors struck quickly, disappearing into the plains before retaliation could arrive. Tibetan border towns built higher walls. Messengers rode day and night, carrying warnings to Lhasa. Sometimes alliances were formed, temporary truces sealed by marriage or shared enemies, but loyalty among the steppes was like the wind. It shifted without warning. To the west, Persian envoys came, cloaked in diplomacy, yet always calculating. Their messages carried subtlety, their gifts weighed with meaning. They watched how Tibet dealt with India, how it influenced Central Asia. Though open conflict was rare, the silence between visits often spoke louder than words. And in the east, China. Always China. Tibetan and Chinese generals played a long game, marching armies, drafting treaties, then breaking them just as swiftly. There were skirmishes along rivers, standoffs on snowy ridges, and tense moments where empires stood one breath from war. But peace, however fragile, often returned. Neither side could afford endless fighting. Through all this, Tibet stood firm. Its leaders knew when to yield and when to strike, when to send monks bearing scrolls, and when to dispatch generals bearing steel. Defense was not only a matter of walls and soldiers, but of wisdom. Understanding the minds behind the borders was as crucial as guarding them. Enemies came and went, but the empire endured, never isolated, always alert, learning across borders. For Tibet, the world beyond its peaks was more than threat or treasure. It was a library, a place of vast and varied learning. And in time, the empire became not just a receiver, but a refiner, gathering knowledge from all directions and reshaping it within the folds of its own wisdom. At the heart of this transformation were the translators. Tibetan monks travelled far to study Sanskrit in its birthplace, bringing back hundreds of texts on logic, medicine, philosophy, and metaphysics. With ink-stained fingers and candle-lit eyes, they worked tirelessly, turning the flowing beauty of Indian scripture into crisp, clear Tibetan. But translation was not mere copying, it was adaptation. Ideas from India met the sensibilities of the Himalayas. Rituals were adjusted, doctrines were questioned. Over time, a uniquely Tibetan form of Buddhism emerged, deep, structured, and intertwined with native beliefs in spirits, sky gods, and hidden energies. From China, they learned about statecraft and celestial calendars. From Persia came stories of alchemy, astrology, and courtly ethics. And from distant Arab lands arrived whispers of mathematics and healing systems, transmitted quietly through traders or adapted by Tibetan scholars in their own way. Medicine became one of Tibet's proudest disciplines. Drawing from Indian Ayurveda, Chinese herbology, and local mountain remedies, the Tibetans compiled great medical texts, treatises that diagnosed illness not only in the body, but in the soul. Even art evolved. Murals in temples showed a fusion of styles, Buddha images drawn with Persian flair, mandalas coloured with Chinese precision. The walls spoke many languages but sang the same truth. Tibet did not lose itself in the world, it found itself within it. By opening its heart and mind, the empire became more than a power. It became a bridge between East and West, between earth and spirit, between the past it inherited and the future it quietly shaped. Chapter 9. The Collapse of the Center. It began with silence. Not the calm kind that lingers in monasteries, but the tense stillness that falls before a storm. In the golden twilight of the Tibetan Empire, a final chapter was being written. One not of triumph, but of unravelling. At its centre stood a single man, King Langdharma. Langdharma was a figure pulled in two directions. Born into the imperial bloodline, He inherited a realm that was still mighty in name, but deeply torn in spirit. The empire he ruled had grown vast, wealthy and complex, but it had also become fragile. At court, ministers whispered warnings. In temples, monks prayed for clarity, and across the valleys, the people watched with weary eyes. Langdharma's reign came at a time of deep religious conflict. His predecessors had embraced Buddhism with open arms, patronizing monasteries and translating sacred texts. But Langdharma, under the sway of traditional Bon priests and skeptical advisors, turned against this wave. He feared the growing power of the monasteries. He saw the monks not as teachers of truth, but as threats to the throne. And so he moved against them. Temples were closed, monasteries were stripped of their land, monks were cast out, their chants replaced by the silence of fear. What had once been a golden age of spiritual flowering began to wither under the cold eye of royal suspicion. But such actions come with consequences. In the year 842, Langdharma was assassinated, some say by a monk disguised as a beggar, others claim it was an insider in his own court. The act was not just a death, it was the cracking of the imperial spine. The last emperor to truly rule over a unified Tibet fell not in war, but in shadow. No procession followed, no grand mourning swept the land. Instead, a vacuum opened, and into that vacuum spilled blood. Brothers and bloodlines, Langdharma's death did not bring closure. It opened a wound, deep and festering. 2 sons, 2 claims, and no clear path. Prince Yumtan and Prince Ösung, both heirs by birth but rivals by fate, each declared themselves rightful ruler. What began as a question of succession quickly ignited into a civil war that burned across the highlands. The people of Tibet, long accustomed to the image of a single sovereign, now watched as their land split between brothers. Castles that once flew the same banner now stood opposed. Families were divided, loyalties were tested. The empire's unity, once enforced by sword and scroll alike, now trembled at its very foundation. In the east, Ösung tried to maintain the old capital's authority. He relied on loyal generals and what remained of the central bureaucracy. In the west, Yumtan gathered followers among the nobles and Bon priests who had survived Langdharma's earlier purges. He promised a return to tradition, a reversal of Buddhist expansion, but neither side gained the strength to fully dominate. Instead, the empire splintered, slowly, then all at once. Provinces once ruled by imperial governors declared independence. Monasteries, once under royal patronage, now answered only to their abbots. Military commanders, seeing the weakness at the center, began to carve out their own domains, protected by personal armies and justified by lineage. The royal bloodline did not vanish, but it lost its power. It became one of many, no longer a sun, but just another flickering candle in a darkening hall. The civil war faded not with a treaty, but with exhaustion, and when the dust finally settled, what had been an empire was now a quilt of fractured kingdoms, each pulling in its own direction. The fracturing of the realm, with the emperor gone and the royal line broken, Tibet began to unravel from the inside. Former ministers, once loyal to the throne, now answered only to themselves. Regional governors ceased sending taxes to Lhasa. Instead, they built their own small courts, raised their own banners, and declared their valleys independent. The great dream of a united empire began to dissolve into a mosaic of warlords and fiefdoms. These new rulers were not all warriors. Some were powerful lamas who had survived Langdama's purges and now led both temples and towns. Others were aristocrats who had waited patiently for the right moment to seize land and power. Still others were simply opportunists, soldiers, who filled the vacuum with blades, not visions. The central administration collapsed. Edicts from the former capital were ignored. The roads that once connected east to west grew over with weeds. Monasteries that had once shared scriptures now fell into doctrinal disputes. Some embraced Indian teachings. Others turned inward, blending Buddhist practices with older Bon traditions, forming new sects entirely. Religious fragmentation mirrored political collapse, and yet there was no great invasion, no enemy at the gate to bring it all crashing down. Tibet fell not to outsiders, but to entropy. The slow, quiet decay of institutions stretched too far for too long. The very systems that had built the empire, the bureaucracy, the temple networks, the military command, all began to rot from within. As the 9th century waned, Tibet became a land of echoes. Echoes of orders once obeyed, of prayers once spoken in unison, of kings who once held the snow-covered plateau in their grasp. Now there was only division, a dozen voices shouting where once there had been one. The death of an empire. There was no final battle. No single moment that marked the end. No grand fire to signal the empire's fall. Instead, it ended with stillness, with the quiet closing of gates that would never open again. The last remnants of imperial Tibet faded slowly, like footprints in drifting snow. Towns that once echoed with royal announcements now stood in silence. The great palaces, once adorned with silks and scrolls, crumbled under neglect. The emperor's throne, untouched and unguarded, became a symbol not of power, but of loss. Monasteries, no longer tied to a central government, became the new centers of stability. In many regions, abbots ruled as both spiritual guides and political leaders. The sword gave way to the rosary, though not always peacefully. But the memory of the empire lingered. Travelers still told stories of the great Tibetan kings who rode through the mountains with golden armor and whispered blessings. Old men recalled the time when one emperor's word could move armies and change calendars. And even as the political structure disappeared, the cultural heart remained intact. Texts continued to be copied. Traditions continued to be passed down. The dream of unity did not die. It simply fell asleep. For the next 4 centuries, Tibet would remain divided, caught in cycles of petty warfare and spiritual revival. It would be a land of many voices, many banners, many gods, and yet beneath it all the soul of the empire endured in language, in prayer, in memory. Not all empires end in fire. Some fade like mist, leaving behind only the quiet glow of what once was. And so ended the central Tibetan Empire. Not with a bang, but with a breath. Chapter 10. The Hidden Kingdoms. After the empire fell, the great plateau did not descend into chaos. It did not burn, nor was it forgotten. Instead, it scattered, like wind-blown snow settling into valleys, finding quiet corners to rest. In place of a single empire, many kingdoms emerged. Small regional powers, once governors, generals, or spiritual leaders, now ruled over fragments of what had once been a vast and unified land. These hidden kingdoms, nestled in the folds of the mountains and the shadows of old fortresses, echoed the imperial past, but each in its own distinct voice. Some clung to memory, they still called their rulers kings, still performed the rites of the imperial court, still wore silk robes dyed with colours once reserved for the capital. Others reimagined power entirely, letting go of old forms, shaping new systems that suited the people, the geography, and the times. The valleys became the stage for a different kind of rule. Kingdoms formed around monasteries, trade crossroads, or strategic hilltops. Fortresses were no longer symbols of empire, but of independence, and in each a distinct culture began to grow, rooted in shared heritage, yet shaped by new leadership, by local belief, and by the rhythm of isolated life. Power in these places was often fragile. It depended on family ties, blessings from spiritual leaders, and the loyalty of village elders. But it was also deeply personal. A king was not a distant figure in a far-off palace. He was a neighbor, a patron, a protector, whose banner might fly just over the next ridge. Though they ruled small domains, many of these leaders saw themselves as heirs to the old Tibetan Empire. They preserved the rituals, sang the same songs, and kept alive the belief that they were not just survivors, but stewards of a great tradition waiting, one day, to be reborn. Monks as kings, in the centuries that followed the fall of the empire, something remarkable took shape. Across the land, where emperors had once ruled with armies and decrees, new rulers arose, not with swords, but with scriptures. Monks became kings. It did not happen all at once. At first, lamas simply gained influence, advising warlords, settling disputes, and overseeing temple lands. But in time, some monasteries grew so wealthy, so respected, and so politically savvy that they began to function as governments. The abbots became both spiritual leaders and political governors, overseeing not only prayer halls but farmland, taxation, and defense. These monk kings wore robes, not armor. They recited mantras in place of war cries. But make no mistake, they held real power. In places like Western Tibet, the fusion of religion and rule became especially strong. Here, monastic institutions became the center of life, economically, spiritually, and politically. Villages aligned themselves with monasteries, not noble houses. Monks trained in debate began managing legal disputes, and when necessary, even armies. These armies were not composed of warrior monks, but of local men who swore loyalty to the Lama, trusting his spiritual authority to guide their cause. Battles were rare, but when they occurred, they were justified, in the language of protection, not conquest. The monk kings saw their role as guardians of Dharma, of justice, of sacred balance. Their legitimacy came not from birthright, but from lineage of teaching, from signs in dreams, and from recognition by other spiritual leaders. Yet even among these rulers, ambition crept in. Some lamas became entangled in rivalries, seeking to expand their influence across valleys and beyond mountains. Others formed alliances with foreign powers or funded massive building projects to demonstrate their authority. Still, the idea remained powerful, that one could govern not by domination, but by guidance, that a prayer wheel might turn the fate of a people just as surely as any crown. The bonne resurgence. In the quiet spaces left behind by the collapse of imperial oversight, something ancient stirred once more. The Bon religion, older than the Buddhist, wave that had swept the empire, older even than the empire itself, began to re-emerge. It did not roar back with force. It returned slowly, like water returning to a dry stream bed. During the empire's height, Bonn had been pushed aside. Its temples had been converted, its priests displaced. Buddhism, with royal patronage and foreign prestige, had become the dominant force. But in the mountains and borderlands, Bonn never disappeared. It simply waited. Now, with the empire gone and Buddhist authority fractured, Bonn resurfaced, not as rebellion, but as renewal. Communities that had long preserved their rituals in secret now practiced openly again. Ancient chants echoed once more across high passes. Bonn priests walked in processions once considered obsolete. Their texts, passed down in whispered lineages, were recopied, and recopied again. But this was not the old Bonn. It had changed. In its time underground, it had absorbed elements of Buddhism, and Buddhism, in turn, had borrowed from Bonn. What emerged in the post-imperial age was a rich, hybrid faith, distinct yet familiar, traditional yet evolving. In many valleys, Bonn and Buddhist communities lived side by side, their festivals overlapping, their prayers blending. Debates happened, sometimes sharp, sometimes soft, over which truth was deeper. But more often people simply lived between the two, embracing both traditions as part of their identity. This resurgence of Bonn was more than a religious revival. It was a cultural remembering, a way for Tibetans to reconnect with the land, with their ancestors, with the stories that predated empires. And, in a world now fragmented, it offered something powerful. Not control, but continuity. Memory and the mountains, as the centuries passed, and the old empire faded further into legend, something remarkable happened. It did not vanish, it transformed. Though the thrones were empty and the banners torn, memory survived. It lived in song and story, in the flickering light of monastery lamps and the careful brush strokes of scribes copying old chronicles. In remote mountain villages, elders still told tales of the Dharma kings, of Songtsen Gampo's wise rule, of Trisong Detsen's spiritual quests, of the rise and fall of Langdharma. These stories were not exact histories. They were woven with myth, softened by generations and rich with symbolism, but they kept the spirit alive. Travelling bards sang epic poems under moonlit skies, their verses stitching together the known and the imagined, the real and the remembered. They sang of empires that once touched the stars, of emperors whose wisdom calmed storms, and of armies that rode through clouds. In the monasteries, the memory was preserved more carefully. Scrolls were locked in chests guarded by generations of monks. Temple murals depicted kings in golden halos, surrounded by deities and teachers. These images were not just decorative, they were reminders that Tibet had once been great and might be again. Lineages, too, became vessels of memory. Monastic orders traced their teachings back to imperial patronage. Noble families traced their bloodlines to royal ancestors. Even in the smallest kingdoms, rulers found strength in claiming descent from imperial days, and so, while Tibet remained divided in form, it stayed united in soul. The mountains held the memory, the valleys whispered it in the wind, and every prayer offered beneath a fluttering banner carried with it the echo of something larger, not just a lost empire, but a lasting identity. In this way, Tibet did not mourn its past. It carried it forward, gently, like a sacred flame cradled against the cold. Chapter 11. The Buddhist Renaissance. Long after the empire had faded, after the great halls had emptied and royal banners had crumbled into dust, something stirred again in the stillness of the Tibetan plateau. Not the march of armies, not the rise of kings, but a breath, a sacred breath, carried through the high mountain winds. The Dharma had returned. It did not return with noise or force. It returned in the soft footfalls of monks climbing forgotten trails. It returned in the rustling of old scrolls unwrapped from silk, in whispered chants spoken before dawn. A renaissance had begun, not in the halls of power, but in the hearts of seekers. Centuries after the fall of the central Tibetan Empire, Tibet awoke to a quiet but powerful spiritual revival. The chaos of fractured kingdoms gave way to a hunger for meaning, and in the sacred silence that followed centuries of division, a new generation of monks and scholars emerged, men and women devoted not to power, but to the path of awakening. The Dharma, once patronized by emperors and performed in gilded temples, now returned through dedication and devotion. Without the support of a central state, these visionaries relied on their own hands, their own hearts. They built temples stone by stone, copied texts word by word, and taught under open skies when roofs could not be found. This was not a revival of memory, it was a renewal of purpose. The teachings of the Buddha, once dimmed by time and politics, began to glow again, clearer, deeper, more rooted. In every valley from Amdo to Utsang, monasteries sprang up. Teachers gathered students not with promises of wealth, but with the offering of wisdom, and as these flames were rekindled, a spiritual light began to stretch once more across the land, faint at first, then brighter, then lasting. Indian masters, Tibetan students. To bring the Dharma home again, Tibet looked southward, toward the land where it had first been born. India, ancient and sacred, was still the beating heart of Buddhist learning. Though many great centers had fallen to the tide of change, others remained. Nalanda, Vikramashila, and remote forest monasteries where Dharma masters still taught the truths of impermanence and liberation. And so the seekers came. Wrapped in thick woolen robes, Tibetan pilgrims crossed the Himalayas with nothing but determination and devotion. Some never returned, their names lost in the snow. But others did, carrying back not only teachings but treasure, not of gold, but of words, of meanings, of insight. These Tibetan students sat at the feet of Indian masters, learning the deep ocean of Buddhist philosophy, logic, debate, ethics, and meditation. They memorized vast texts, chanted sutras in Sanskrit, and received empowerments in sacred rites passed down through generations. Some spent decades in India, others made repeat journeys, and slowly a bridge was built between the source and the seeker, between the wisdom of India and the resilience of Tibet. Among the most important of these was the great translator Songtsen Gampo, known as the Jewel of the World. He brought back over 100 texts, trained artisans to build temples in the Indian style and spread the teachings throughout Western Tibet. But he was not alone. Countless others followed, some known, many forgotten. Their footprints faded from the mountain trails, but their impact lived on. They were more than students. They were carriers of light, because in every scroll they carried home, in every mantra they whispered into the wind, was a seed, one that would grow into the towering tradition of Tibetan Buddhism we know today. Translation and transformation. The journey of the Dharma did not end at the border. It had to be reborn carefully, word by word, line by line, in the language of a people who had waited generations to receive it again. This was the era of the great translations. In dusty monasteries and candle-lit caves, teams of scholars and monks worked tirelessly to render the Sanskrit teachings into Tibetan. But translation was no simple task. The language of enlightenment is subtle. A single word could carry lifetimes of meaning, and so they worked slowly, precisely, reverently. They created new words where old ones did not exist. They refined grammar to hold complex ideas. They developed a rich spiritual vocabulary that would shape the Tibetan language for centuries to come. In doing so, they did more than translate, they transformed. Every translated sutra was a bridge between worlds. Every tantra became a doorway. Every commentary became a map through the landscape of the mind. Entire libraries were born during this time. The Kangyo and Tengyo, the collections of translated words of the Buddha and the Indian commentaries, grew to thousands of volumes. Their creation was not merely academic, it was an act of devotion, an act of preservation, an act
of love. And as the texts spread, so did understanding.
Monks debated their meanings in mountain courtyards. Students memorized verses by moonlight. Teachers explained subtle points of view with clarity and calm. In these moments, the Dharma came alive, not just as doctrine, but as experience. Tibetan Buddhism became more than a replica. It became its own light. Rooted in India, but blooming in Himalayan soil. Reflecting the timeless truths, but shaped by a people whose faith had endured empires. Foundations of the future out of these efforts. Out
of journeys, out of translations, out of devotion, a new foundation was laid, one that would not crumble like thrones or castles.
One that would last. The Buddhist Renaissance of Tibet gave birth to something enduring. The great schools of Tibetan Buddhism. The Nyingma, Sakya, Kagyu, and later the Gelug. Each with its own teachings, lineages, masters, and methods. Each a different stream flowing from the same sacred mountain. The Nyingma, oldest of all, carried the early transmissions of tantric practice, hidden in caves and hearts during times of persecution. The Kagyu emphasized meditation and direct experience, their masters walking the land as humble yogis. The Sakya blended scholarly precision with ritual elegance, and the Gelug, shaped by Tsongkhapa, brought structure and clarity that would eventually guide even the governance of Tibet itself. These schools were not in competition. They were facets of a jewel, each illuminating a different path to awakening. The monasteries grew. Some housed thousands of monks. They became centers of learning, art, medicine, and ritual. Pilgrims journeyed for days just to receive a single teaching. Festivals were held that brought together entire regions. Debate became an art. Teaching became a life's purpose. And beyond the walls, the teachings flowed into the people. Farmers learned compassion through stories. Nomads carried prayer flags into the wind. Children recited mantras at night. Tibetan Buddhism had become more than a faith. It had become a culture, a civilization, a way of being that touched every part of life. And through it all, the memory of the old empire remained, not as a lost golden age, but as the soil in which this renaissance had grown. The teachings had once been patronized by kings. Now they were protected by generations of monks, scholars, and lay people. In the quiet heart of Tibet, something more powerful than empire had taken root, a vision, a practice, a path, and it would continue. For
centuries, for lifetimes.
Chapter 12. The Age of the Monastic Kingdoms. High on the windswept plateaus of Tibet, where clouds drift like ancient spirits and the sky seems close enough to touch, a new kind of kingdom began to rise. These were not realms built by emperors or guarded by armies. They were realms built of stone and silence, sanctuaries of devotion, learning, and spiritual power. The monasteries. In the centuries after the empire's collapse, while political power fractured and royal thrones stood empty, the monasteries became the new centers of Tibetan life. They were fortresses not of war but of wisdom. With walls thick and high, they sheltered scriptures instead of swords, and within them a new generation of leaders took shape, abbots and lamas who guided not only the soul but society itself. Some monasteries were small, carved into cliffs, their courtyards barely enough for a dozen monks to gather. Others sprawled across hillsides like sacred cities, their rooftops golden, their halls echoing with the low chant of prayers repeated over centuries. These places were not merely homes for meditation, they were institutions, centers of administration, diplomacy and education. Monasteries collected taxes, maintained order, mediated disputes, and trained monks who would go on to influence every level of Tibetan culture. Each monastery had its own rhythm, the ringing of the bell before dawn, the spinning of prayer. Wheels at midday, the smoke of juniper rising into cold evening air. Pilgrims came from distant valleys offering grain, butter, or coins in exchange for blessings and guidance. In return, the monasteries gave shelter, hope, and a sense of shared purpose. They were beacons in a land without a crown, not empires of territory, but empires of trust, rooted not in conquest, but in contemplation. And in this quiet power, the foundations of a new Tibetan identity were laid. Rival schools and lineages as the monasteries expanded, so too did the teachings they
carried.
The Dharma, once fragile and scattered, now bloomed in multiple forms. From this sacred soil emerged the great schools of Tibetan Buddhism, each a unique path toward enlightenment, each guided by its own lineage of teachers, each supported by local patrons and noble clans. The Nyingma, or Ancient Ones, were the keepers of the earliest teachings. Their texts, many hidden during times of persecution and rediscovered as spiritual treasures, blended Indian Tantra with indigenous Tibetan rituals. They believed in the power of transmission across lifetimes, that wisdom could be awakened not only through study, but through deep connection to sacred memory. The Kagyu lineage emphasized direct experience. Its masters, like the great Mapa and his disciple Milarepa, taught that realization came not just from books but from practice, from long retreats, yogic discipline, and the transformation of suffering into song. The Kagyu monks were often wanderers, known for their simplicity and spiritual depth. Then came the Sakya school, scholarly, precise, and regal. With strong ties to noble families and international diplomacy, Sakya lamas often served as advisors to rulers beyond Tibet's borders. Their monasteries were known for structured training, logic, and ritual elegance. These schools were not at war, but they were in competition for students, for land, for the allegiance of patrons. Local rulers often aligned themselves with a particular sect, building temples and supporting monasteries that reflected their personal beliefs or political interests. But despite their rivalries, there was also harmony. Debates were held not with violence, but with reasoned argument. Lamas respected each other's lineages, and spiritual exchanges flowed freely across sectarian lines. This diversity of thought did not weaken Tibetan Buddhism. It enriched it, creating a vast, living tapestry of teachings that could meet the needs of every seeker in every corner of the land. Scholar saints and hermits, beyond the monastery walls, in caves hidden by snow and forests lit only by moonlight, another kind of teacher walked the land. These were the scholar saints, the hermits, the mystics whose voices still echo through time. They lived far from the courts and cloisters, yet their influence reached every temple and heart. They spoke not from pulpits, but from experience, the kind earned in solitude, in silence, in struggle. Foremost among them was Milarepa. Once a youth, twisted by anger and revenge, Milarepa turned away from violence and embraced the path of deep renunciation. Under the stern guidance of his teacher Marpa, he endured great hardship, not as punishment, but as purification. Milarepa's life became a legend. Clad in thin cloth even in winter, he meditated in mountain caves, surviving.
On nettles and snow, he sang his teachings in simple verses, songs of longing, insight, joy, and release.
His voice, carried by wind, reached villages and valleys, inspiring generations. Others followed similar paths. Some were born into noble families and gave up wealth for wisdom. Others were villagers who had visions or dreams or callings too strong to ignore. They became wandering yogis, storytellers, dreamers, and guides. They were not concerned with lineage or politics. Their kingdom was the mind. Their throne was the cushion of stillness. Their power came not from institutions, but from the truth. They lived, and Tibet listened. Their teachings entered the hearts of the people, not as distant philosophy, but as lived example. They reminded the world that enlightenment was not just for monks or scholars, it was for anyone willing to look within, to let go, to love deeply and wisely. These saints walked alone, but their footsteps became paths for countless others to follow. Harmony and competition in time, the monasteries grew not just in size, but in influence. They became not only spiritual centers, but arbiters of power. Abbeys negotiated land rights. Monastic councils mediated disputes between villages. Some even coordinated regional defenses when outside threats loomed. The abbots were no longer just teachers. They were leaders, spiritual and administrative, mystical and practical. This blending of roles brought both harmony and tension. On one hand, it created stability. In a land still fractured by geography and history, the monasteries offered common values, education, and moral guidance. They were a network of light across the dark hills, places where one could find both refuge and resolve. On the other hand, power is power. Rival monasteries sometimes clashed over land ownership. Disagreements about doctrine could become regional disputes. Powerful lamas, backed by wealthy patrons or armies, sometimes imposed their will in ways that mirrored the politics they once sought to transcend. Yet, amidst these complexities, balance remained. the spiritual aspiration at the core.
Of monastic life acted as a compass. Even when power tempted, the teachings reminded all that this life was impermanent.
That fame fades, that attachment blinds. Ceremonies continued, festivals united villages, debates sharpened minds, compassion guided action, and so the age of the monastic kingdoms became one of remarkable flowering, where the inner and outer worlds met, where wisdom was not locked away in silence, but expressed in governance, in community, in the shared rhythm of daily life. In the end, these kingdoms lasted longer than empires, because they were not built on conquest but on conscience, not on dominion but on devotion. And in the cold, clear air of the Tibetan plateau, they stood as reminders that true power lies not in how far one can rule, but in how deeply one can awaken. Chapter 13. Invasion and Influence. In the vast sweep of world history, few names echo as powerfully as the Mongols. Fierce riders from the steppes, masters of war, builders of the largest contiguous empire the world has ever seen. Their banners flew from the Yellow Sea to the heart of Europe. And yet, when they reached the edge of the Tibetan plateau, something unexpected happened. They did not invade. They listened. In the 13th century, as Mongol forces conquered cities and crushed dynasties, they cast their gaze toward the quiet land of Tibet, a region of mountains, monasteries, and mystics. To many, it seemed a certain conquest, but Tibet offered no army, no resistance. Instead, they offered wisdom. The Mongols, especially under Mungke Khan and later Kublai Khan, were not just warriors. They were curious. They sought knowledge as much as land, seeking to understand the religions of the peoples they ruled. And from Tibet came a path unlike any they had encountered, a spiritual system rooted in stillness, compassion, and inner transformation. The meeting was quiet. A Tibetan Lama, Sakya Pandita, was invited to the Mongol court, not as a prisoner, but as a guest. He did not bring soldiers, he brought teachings. He offered not submission, but guidance. The Mongols, fierce in body but hungry in spirit, listened. They asked questions, they watched the rituals, and in the quiet presence of the lamas, they found something they could not take with swords: peace. And so an alliance was formed, not forged in battle, but in mutual recognition. The Mongols gave their protection. The Tibetans gave their insight. It was the beginning of a relationship that would reshape both empires and echo through centuries. Spiritual advisors to emperors in the golden halls of the Mongol courts, where banners waved like fire and warriors. Debated beside scholars, Tibetan monks began to walk softly among kings. They did not command armies, but they began to shape empires. As the Mongols expanded into China and established the Yuan dynasty, they brought with them not only their generals and governors, but their newfound reverence for Tibetan Buddhism. The court of Kublai Khan became a place not only of administration, but of ritual. Alongside scribes and military strategists stood lamas, men in robes of crimson and gold, holding prayer beads instead of scrolls. These monks did not preach, they advised, they interpreted dreams, selected auspicious dates for campaigns, conducted elaborate ceremonies to protect the empire from spiritual threats. And slowly they became more than counselors. They became symbols, bridges between heaven and earth, between power and purpose. Chief among them was Phagpa, nephew of Sakya Pandita. Appointed as imperial preceptor, he was granted authority not only over religious matters, but over Tibet itself. He created a script to unify Mongol writing. He conducted rituals for the emperor. He traveled with dignity and trust. Tibetan Buddhism, once confined to the highlands, now flowed through the marble gates of Dadu, the Mongol capital that would become modern Beijing. At temples built across the empire, Mongol nobles took initiation vows. They studied philosophy, patronized translation efforts, and built monuments to the Buddha. The Tibetan lamas had become more than monks. They were now spiritual architects of empire, and in return, the Mongols gave more than titles. They gave protection, autonomy, respect. For a time, the conquerors of the world bowed their heads before the quiet strength of Tibetan wisdom. The patron-priest relationship. Out of this unlikely alliance came a model that would define Tibetan governance. For generations, the sacred dance of patron and priest. In this unique relationship, the secular ruler, often an emperor or Khan, served as the protector. The Lama, the spiritual teacher, guided the soul. One held power, the other purpose. It was not always equal, it was not always without tension, but it was balanced, a mutual recognition that each needed the other. For the Mongols, the Lama provided legitimacy. In a world full of conquests and rebellions, the spiritual blessing of a holy man gave their rule divine weight. It wasn't just that they ruled, it was that they were meant to rule. For the Tibetans, the patron provided safety. Under the gaze of the Mongol Khans, Tibetan monasteries flourished. Temples were rebuilt, texts were preserved, rival factions were kept in check by imperial decree. This model would not remain only in the 13th century. It would return again in later centuries, in the Ming, the Qing, and even within Tibet's own internal governance. The idea was powerful, that spiritual wisdom and worldly authority could coexist, that neither was supreme, that both could serve. In Tibetan language, this relationship is remembered as Choyon, Dharma and generosity. The Lama offers the path. The patron supports it. And though empires rose and fell, this model endured. Like a quiet vow echoing through time, it reminded all who sought power, without wisdom, strength is blind, and reminded those who sought wisdom, without protection, truth cannot endure. Tibet, beyond the mountains, from the snowy heights of Lhasa to the plains of Mongolia, the teachings of Tibet began to travel, not by conquest, but by invitation. As monks became advisors and teachers across Asia, a new form of Tibetan influence took root, one not tied to borders, but to belief. Temples in China began to follow Tibetan rituals. Mongol Khans built stupas in distant lands. In Central Asia, travelers carried prayer wheels and stories of lamas who could summon peace through mantras. Even as far as Russia, echoes of Tibetan Buddhist influence appeared, through art, through philosophy, through the quiet spread of faith. This was soft power at its most profound. Tibet, which had once wielded armies, now wielded ideas. It sent not swords, but scrolls, not ambassadors, but initiates. Its influence moved through relationships, not territory, through language, not force. And even as the Mongol Empire fractured, the teachings remained. New schools rose, old ones adapted. The relationship between teacher and protector evolved, but never disappeared. In time, Tibet's identity became more than geography. It became a spiritual landscape, one that stretched beyond mountains and valleys across cultures and languages. A place could fall, a city could burn, but a teaching once given could live forever. And so the lamas who once sat humbly before Khans had done something rare in history. They had turned the momentum of an empire not toward conquest, but toward contemplation. The winds that once carried the dust of war now carried chants. And in the silence that followed battle, one could hear, if one listened, the soft turning of a prayer wheel. Chapter 14. Legacy of the Empire. The empire had fallen. Its thrones were empty, its palaces reclaimed by time. Yet in the hush of the high valleys, in the soft turning of prayer wheels, and in the low hum of evening chants, something remained, something deeper than stone or scroll. Memory. Long after the last emperor bowed to history, the Tibetan people carried the empire in their hearts. It was no longer a map or a government. It had become something more lasting, a myth that shaped identity, a spirit that breathed quietly beneath daily life. They remembered not just the kings, but what they stood for. Songtsen Gampo, who brought unity. Trisong who welcomed the Dharma. And the vision of a nation guided by wisdom as much as by law. These figures became more than rulers. They became ancestors of the mind. Children were told stories of golden thrones and divine rulers, of armies led by monks and mountains, that bowed to the will of Dharma kings. Farmers paused in their fields to chant prayers that once echoed in imperial halls. Elders traced their family lines back to ministers who had once served at court. In this quiet remembering, the empire lived on. It was not a longing for conquest or grandeur. It was something gentler, a sense of belonging to a greater story. Even as Tibet fractured into small kingdoms and monastic enclaves, the idea of a united land, just and sacred, remained. The empire, in its absence, became a presence, a thread of gold running through the fabric of Tibetan identity. Myth made marrow. A past never fully gone. A foundation for all that came after. Echoes in governance, though the empire had vanished from the world stage, its structure left an imprint, not in palaces, but in patterns, not in rulers, but in rhythms. In the centuries that followed, Tibet's political models were shaped by echoes of imperial design, monastic states, noble houses, and later, the dual leadership of lamas and lay rulers all carried the mark of a system that once unified the high plateau. The idea of central governance, though often elusive in practice, persisted in principle. Monasteries adopted hierarchies that resembled old imperial councils. Lama lineages were recorded with the care once reserved for royal succession. Even regional assemblies borrowed terminology from imperial institutions. The Gelugpa school, which would rise to prominence in the 15th century, further revived this vision. Under the leadership of the Dalai Lamas, a new model emerged, one that combined spiritual guidance with temporal authority. It was not empire in name, but in spirit it reached for the same goal: order through wisdom. The Potala Palace, towering over Lhasa, was more than a seat of power. It was a symbol, a mountain fortress that called back to ancient rule. Its corridors echoed with footsteps that followed the memory of kings. Its chambers held debates, decisions, and ceremonies that mirrored those once held in imperial courts. Even diplomatic exchanges reflected the past. Foreign visitors were greeted with rituals rooted in imperial protocols. Officials signed decrees with seals that bore symbols of vanished dynasties. The architecture of rule had shifted, but its foundation held strong. It was as though the empire had been absorbed into the bones of governance. Quietly, without insistence, it continued, not as law, but as legacy. Symbols of sovereignty across the snowy ridges and green valleys, fragments of the empire remained, not in armies or fortresses, but in symbols, in flags, relics, and sacred titles that passed from hand to hand like holy fire. These remnants became more than artifacts, they became anchors. The old imperial seal, once pressed into letters sent across the Silk Road, was kept in a monastery, treated not just as a piece of metal, but as a vessel of blessing. Cloth banners, embroidered with ancient mantras, hung in temples, their threads faded, but their meaning untouched. Legends told of a golden stupa buried beneath the earth, containing the bones of a Dharma king. Songs remembered the way banners used to flutter outside the imperial court. Each colour a prayer, each fold a vow. The titles of past rulers lived on, reborn in monastic lineages. Dharma king, once used for emperors, was now whispered when speaking of great teachers. Chakravartin, the wheel-turning monarch, became a term of reverence, not for warriors, but for those who guided with insight. Ceremonies once performed in royal courts were adopted by abbots. Crowns of woven silk were placed on heads of reincarnated lamas. Drums beat in patterns said to echo the pulse of ancient imperial rites. In this way, the symbols outlived the statesmen, the gestures outlived the governments. To outsiders, they may have seemed like relics. But to Tibetans, they were bridges, reaching across time, connecting the living with the legacy. Each chant, each emblem, each sacred object carried with it a whisper. Remember who we were. Remember who we still are, the pulse of a lost power. And so the empire that once rose with armies and laws now moved differently, quietly, like wind, through prayer flags. Its power was no longer measured by borders, but by breath. It lived in the slow spin of a prayer wheel, turned by hands both young and old, in the soft murmur of mantras spoken before sleep, in the lines of sand mandalas, swept away not in loss but in grace. The people of Tibet did not need thrones to feel sovereign. Their sovereignty was in their songs, in the way grandmothers taught blessings to children, in the way yaks were adorned during festivals, in the stories passed from traveller to traveller, beneath stars that once watched emperors ride. Every mountain held a memory. Every pass had once been crossed by monks or messengers of the court. The land itself had learned to carry the empire, not as a burden, but as a blessing. Oral history became the heartbeat of tradition. It was not written in marble, but in voice, in the rhythm of chanting, in the poetry of silence between verses. It travelled not in ink, but in tone, and so Tibet remained whole, not on maps, but in meaning. Empires fall. That is the way of things. But some powers do not end. They change. They soften. They become invisible, yet ever present. Imperial Tibet, in all its brilliance and brevity, had become more than history. It had become a current, moving through generations, carried in rituals, in dreams, in the simple act of remembering. And even now, if you listen closely, you can hear it, in the whisper of juniper smoke, in the hush between temple bells, in the pulse of a people who still walk with the past beneath their feet and carry it gently, like a prayer, into tomorrow. Chapter 15. The Roof of the World Endures. High above the world, where clouds drift like silent caravans and mountains whisper their frozen hymns, there lies a land unlike any other. A land shaped not by the hammer of war, nor the thirst for conquest, but by wind, by stillness, and by silence. Tibet, the roof of the world. Here the sky is not just above you, it surrounds you. It wraps around the land like a cloak of light, thin and endless. The earth is dusted in snow that glows under moonlight and dazzles under the morning sun, as if each flake remembers the touch of a higher realm. Time stretches out in long silences between temple bells, and the wind carries more than just cold. It carries presence. Though the empire is gone, the spirit remains. It lingers in the mountain passes, in the breath of thin air, in the eyes of old monks who sit cross-legged in the half-dark, lips barely moving, minds anchored deep beneath the surface of thought. It is there in prayer wheels that spin endlessly, in butter lamps that flicker beside statues of golden serenity, and in mantras whispered by wrinkled lips that have seen centuries pass in the blink of a still mind. This is no longer an empire of armies or banners. It is an empire of silence, an empire of spirit. To walk through Tibet today is not to walk through ruins, but to move through a dream that never ended. It is a place where the sacred is not stored in monuments alone, but in the very air. Thin, crisp, and utterly still. Each footstep falls softly on soil shaped by millennia of devotion. Each breath feels like a prayer. And though the maps no longer paint it in the colours of kings, the land still holds its crown, not of gold or jewels, but of light, wind, and sky. The empire in the heart empires rise. Empires fall. But some never truly disappear. They live, unheld not by power, but by memory. The Tibetan Empire, once fierce and wide, has long since faded from the world's political stage. Yet its heart beats on, not in palaces, but in pages, not in soldiers, but in silence. In remote monasteries, monks gather before dawn, their chants rising like smoke into the high rafters. The walls are lined with ancient texts, pages yellowed by time but glowing with wisdom. These scriptures tell stories of kings and yogis, of battles and visions, of the great emperor Songtsen Gampo, who dreamed of unity through compassion, of the scholar monk Padmasambhava, who walked through fire
and storm to bring peace to the land. These are not just stories.
They are living memories, recited, studied, sung. Every word carries the weight of generations passed from mouth to ear, heart to breath. A monk's voice chanting a 1,000-year-old verse becomes a bridge between past and present. In that moment, the empire is alive. Pilgrims come from across the plateau, their faces weathered by sun and devotion. Some walk for days, even weeks, their hands pressed together, eyes steady on distant temples. Others bow at every step, their bodies touching the earth in full surrender. They come not to see a capital or a throne. They come to feel the empire that lives not on land, but in the soul, even in the hum of spinning prayer wheels, the empire returns. Each spin is a vow, each turn a quiet revolution of the heart. Where others carved history in stone, Tibet carved it in breath, and in that breath it remains. Timelessness in the high winds. There is something strange in the wind that blows across the Tibetan plateau. It is not just cold, it is ancient. It does not rush like a storm, it glides, it hums, and in its rhythm time seems to soften. Modern life is built on speed, on schedules, noise and motion. But here, in the shadow of mountains older than memory, everything slows. The sun rises gently, shadows stretch across valleys like great sleeping spirits. Even sound moves differently, absorbed into the vast openness of sky and land. Time in Tibet does not tick. It breathes. Old monasteries cling to cliff faces, their stones warmed by centuries of prayer. Inside, butter lamps flicker without hurry. A monk pours tea with the precision of someone who has known stillness all his life. A child sits beside him, watching, not bored, but absorbed. Learning not facts, but rhythm. This is the timelessness of Tibet, not the absence of time, but its deepening. A different kind of time, one not measured in minutes, but in moments of presence. In the way a yak bell echoes through the valley. In the way clouds drift like ancient scrolls unfurled across the heavens. In the way an old woman spins her prayer, beads, eyes closed, lips moving slowly, rhythmically, as if speaking directly to the sky. To visit Tibet is to be reminded of something the modern world has forgotten, that not everything must move fast, that there is wisdom in waiting, beauty in stillness, and truth in silence. Here, amidst the high winds, the empire has become something else, not a relic, but a rhythm, not a history, but a heartbeat, steady, slow, and eternal, a soft farewell to the mountains, and now we come to the edge of the story, not an ending, but a stillness, a breath between worlds. The Tibetan Empire may be gone in name, but not in nature. It has transformed, from kingdom to spirit, from sword to silence.
And as we leave this place, we carry with us not just history, but a feeling.
A memory not of events, but of essence. Imagine standing on a high ridge at dusk. The mountains rise all around, silent and immense. The wind brushes your face, cool, patient, knowing. Far below, a bell rings once, then fades. The sky turns from gold to blue, then into that deep, velvet black that only Tibet seems to know. You close your eyes, and for a moment, everything falls away. The noise, the rush, the weight of the world. What remains is breath, cold, clear, calm. That is Tibet, a place where empires do not end, they become something gentler, something truer, where time does not erase but deepens, where silence does not mean emptiness but fullness. So let us leave now not with sorrow, but with gratitude, for the story we have heard, for the spirit we have felt, for the journey we have walked, from warrior kings to whispering winds, from conquests to clouds. Let the tales settle in your heart like snow on a mountain path, light, quiet, lasting, and, as you drift into sleep, remember high above the world, the roof of the world still endures, in wind, in silence, in soul. Chapter 16. The Dalai Lama and the Rebirth of Rule. In the far reaches of the Himalayan highlands, where sky and stone seemed to blend into one seamless horizon, a quiet revolution began to unfold, not with sword or fire, but with silence, lineage, and belief. By the 15th century, Tibet was no longer the empire it had once been. The great kings were gone, their banners lost to time. But the spirit of rule, of guidance, had not vanished. It was simply waiting, hidden in monasteries, written in scrolls, whispered in the breath of prayer. From this silence, a new kind of leader emerged, not born of royal blood, but recognized through something deeper, a soul that returns again and again. This was the idea of tulku, the belief that enlightened beings could reincarnate to serve the world, lifetime after lifetime, and among these sacred returns, one would rise to reshape the destiny of a people. The Dalai Lama. The title Dalai Lama means Ocean of Wisdom. It was first granted to Sonam Gyatso, the third in this spiritual line, by a Mongol Khan in 1578. Yet it was retroactively applied to his two predecessors, recognizing them as earlier incarnations of the same awakened being. From then on, the tradition was set the soul of the Dalai Lama would return again and again, each time as a child discovered through dreams, signs, and visions. This was no mere mysticism. For the Tibetan people, it was a sacred contract between the heavens and the earth. The Dalai Lama was not just a teacher. He was a bridge between lives, between realms, between the past and the present. In a world often ruled by power and fear, Tibet chose something gentler. A child whose wisdom was older than any throne. And so, through frost-covered valleys and sun-drenched plateaus, the word would go out. A search had begun. Somewhere, in some remote village, a boy had been born, a boy who did not just remember, but was remembered, from monk to monarch. As the tradition of the Dalai Lama grew, so too did the responsibilities placed upon his shoulders. What began as a spiritual guide quietly blossomed into something greater, a ruler of both faith and state. In the 17th century, this shift became clear with the rise of the fifth Dalai Lama, Ngawang Lobsang Gyatso, a man of deep insight, political vision, and unshakable presence. He was the first Dalai Lama to unite all of central Tibet under one rule, blending the sacred with the secular. With the backing of Mongol forces, he consolidated power, ended internal strife, and brought a sense of order to the scattered highlands. But unlike emperors of the past, his leadership was not built on conquest. It was built on trust, on the belief that wisdom, not weapons, could guide a nation. This monk-turned-monarch held court, issued decrees, and managed the affairs of a complex society. He met with emissaries, balanced regional disputes, and oversaw the development of a new Tibetan identity. Under his rule, the Dalai Lama became more than a figurehead. He became the very heartbeat of Tibet's governance, the quiet center, from which decisions flowed, and yet, despite his power, he never ceased to be a monk. He wore the maroon robes of simplicity. He meditated, he taught, he prayed. His life was a living balance between the worldly and the divine. In the centuries that followed, this model endured. Each Dalai Lama, though shaped by the world around him, carried the same dual role, to lead a people not just in policy but in purpose. They were rulers without armies, kings without crowns, guiding their nation through the force of compassion, the weight of legacy, and the silent strength of continuity. Potala Palace and the new Lhasa, atop the red hill in Lhasa, a structure rises like a dream cast in stone. The Potala Palace, towering over the city, its white and ochre walls glow in the shifting light, as if holding the memory of every prayer ever spoken within its halls. But this is more than architecture. It is a vision brought to life, a testament to Tibet's rebirth under the rule of the Dalai Lamas. Commissioned by the fifth Dalai Lama in the mid-1600s, the Potala was built as both a residence and a spiritual seat. Inspired by the harmony between earth and sky, its 13 stories contain over 1,000 rooms, chapels, meditation chambers, tombs and libraries, each steeped in incense and silence. From afar, it appears like a mountain carved by human
hands. From within, it feels like the heart of Tibet itself. The palace became a symbol of unity, of permanence, of return.
It watched over Lhasa as the capital transformed, from a scattered collection of shrines and homes into a city of sacred rhythm. Pilgrims travelled for months to see it. Inside, monks chanted by candlelight. Outside, prayer flags fluttered like the breath of the wind. And high above, the Potala stood, steady, serene. To build such a monument in this unforgiving terrain was no small feat. It required vision, labour, and faith. But more than that, it required a reason. The Dalai
Lama's rule gave that reason. It wasn't power that the Potala expressed. It was purpose. A commitment to a future rooted in the past.
A declaration that Tibet, though changed, was not lost, and so the Potala rose, not as a fortress, but as a sanctuary, not as a reminder of war, but of peace. It endures still today, a silent watchtower over a city that holds the memory of a nation reborn. A rebirth from the ashes. Empires often try to return the way they were, through force, through conquest, through the rebuilding of armies and laws. But Tibet chose a different path. After centuries of division, after the fall of kings and the rise of uncertainty, its rebirth came not through battlefields, but through belief. The Dalai Lamas did not seek to recreate the old empire. They did not redraw borders or rebuild thrones. Instead, they reclaimed something deeper, the moral soul of the nation. Under their guidance, Tibet became a place where spiritual wisdom and political structure met, where governance served the people not just in law but in meaning. This was a new kind of power, it not rooted in fear, but in compassion, not enforced by walls but upheld by prayer. Tibet's return was not about reclaiming land, it was about reclaiming identity. Monasteries became the centers of community life. Teachers became leaders. The sound of chanting replaced the sound of marching feet. In every village the story was the same, a quiet resilience, a steady renewal. The past was not buried. It was carried forward, not as a weight, but as a guide. Even in the face of external pressure and internal challenge, this spiritual rebirth endured. It taught that empires need not return as shadows of what they were. They can evolve, they can soften, they can grow into something wiser. Tibet under the Dalai Lamas became a living lesson that true strength lies not in holding power, but in letting go of what no longer serves, that the greatest rebirths come not in fire, but in stillness. And so the Tibetan Empire, once fierce and wide, found its second life. Not in swords or stones, but in the soul of a people who chose the path of peace. Chapter 17. The Spirit of Tibet in the Modern World. In the quiet of the early morning, under a pale Indian sky, a small procession winds its way through the hills of Dharamshala. The footsteps are gentle, measured, the robes of the monks catching the breeze like saffron-coloured sails. At the heart of this peaceful rhythm walks a figure known around the world, His Holiness, the 14th Dalai Lama. But behind his smile lies a story carried by millions. The story of a nation that lost its land, but never its soul. In 1959, amid growing tensions and a failed uprising against Chinese rule, the Dalai Lama crossed the snowy mountains into exile. Disguised as a soldier, guided by stars and prayer, he escaped Tibet with a small group of trusted followers. The journey was dangerous but urgent, for with his departure, the future of Tibetan identity was placed into motion, not through force, but through endurance. India offered sanctuary. The town of Dharamshala became the new home of the Tibetan. Government in exile, a hilltop haven where language, culture and faith could survive. And survive they did. Exile, rather than severing the past, helped preserve it. From monasteries rebuilt in the foothills of the Himalayas to schools that taught children the script of their ancestors, the spirit of the empire found new soil in which to grow. The Tibetan diaspora stretched across the world, to Europe, North America, and beyond. Families carried only memories and prayer beads, but that was enough. Festivals continued, songs were sung, stories were told. The empire was no longer in stone or in banners, but in breath, passed on across dinner tables, whispered into the ears of newborns, written in letters sent across oceans. Exile did not end the Tibetan Empire. It transformed it into something more enduring, a living echo that crossed borders with grace, carried in hearts rather than on maps. Tibetan Buddhism on the global stage. As the 20th century unfolded, the world began to change, fast, loud, and uncertain. People everywhere searched for something quieter, something ancient, something still. Into that space came the gentle voice of Tibetan Buddhism, a tradition that had endured for over 1,000 years, now stepping quietly onto the global stage. The teachings of the Dalai Lama spread like ripples across still water, not through conquest but through curiosity. In lecture halls, meditation centers, and living rooms, he spoke not of politics but of peace. He spoke of compassion as strength, of kindness as revolution, of the mind as the final frontier. Books followed. The Art of Happiness. Ethics for the New Millennium. Words once carried by yak caravans over mountain passes now reached readers by the millions, translated into dozens of languages. These weren't just religious texts. They were invitations to pause, to breathe, to see the world differently. Monks who once lived in hidden monasteries found themselves on speaking tours, guiding retreats, answering questions from students. Seekers, skeptics, their chants were recorded, their teachings streamed online, and still they remained calm, steady, rooted, unchanged. The West did not convert en masse. That was never the goal, but it listened. And in listening, something shifted. Mindfulness became a household word. Compassion became a value, not just a virtue. The presence of Tibetan wisdom on the global stage reminded the modern world that spirituality need not be loud. that truth can be found in stillness. Through exile, Tibet lost its land, but through its teachings, it gained the world. The global pilgrims. They come from every corner of the earth. Artists and engineers, nurses and nomads, teenagers with restless hearts and elders with quiet eyes. Some come by plane, some by foot. Some seek healing, others seek answers. All are drawn by a whisper, the quiet pull of something deeper than reason. They come to Tibet, or what remains of it, not just to see, but to feel. They arrive in Nepal, Bhutan, India, places where Tibetan monasteries still rise against the backdrop of Himalayan sky. They remove their shoes, they bow, they sit cross-legged
on cold stone floors, listening to chants they cannot translate, yet somehow understand.
They drink butter tea with wrinkled monks, walk clockwise around stupas, spin prayer wheels that have turned 1,000,000 times before. These are not tourists. They are pilgrims, travellers of the spirit, and the journey they take is as much inward as outward. In Dharamshala, they line up before dawn to catch a glimpse of the Dalai Lama, not as a celebrity, but as a teacher, a reminder. They wait not for miracles, but for words, and when he speaks, the silence between sentences feels like a lesson in itself. In the hills of Ladakh or the temples of Kathmandu, seekers join in rituals they barely know how to pronounce. Yet they kneel with sincerity. They listen. They cry. And when they return home, to Paris, to Sao Paulo, to Seoul, they carry something invisible but real, a presence, a softness, a new way of seeing. Tibet has become more than a place. It has become a path, a symbol, a call to remember that beyond speed and noise there is still the whisper of the sacred. And people hear it. All over the world, they answer. The mountain still whispers. The story of Tibet is not one of endings but of echoes. Though the empire has passed into history, and though its borders have faded from the maps of the world, the mountain still whispers. Its voice is not loud, it does not shout. It moves like wind through prayer flags, like water beneath ice, like thought before words. But it is there, patient, ancient, alive. Tibet remains. Not just in Dharamshala or Lhasa or the dusty corners of exile. It remains in the way. A person pauses before speaking, in the way hands fold in silence, in the eyes of a monk who smiles without reason, in the breath of a stranger who chooses kindness over anger. These are not small things, they are the seeds of something vast. For, in a world pulled by conflict and speed, Tibet reminds us of a different rhythm, slow, sacred, sincere, a rhythm where presence matters more than power, where stillness is not empty, but full. Even now the snow still falls on the mountains. The yaks still move through silent valleys. The stars still hang above the rooftops of temples carved into stone. And deep within, the spirit of the empire endures, not through control, but through clarity. It is not gone. It has changed form. It lives in the memory of those who remember, in the hope of those who seek, in the breath of those who pray. And maybe tonight, as the world settles into darkness and the hum of sleep begins to rise, you can hear it too. That soft voice from the roof of the world. A voice not of command, but of calling. The mountain still whispers.